This program is made possible in part by Cerisi Conlon LLP, protecting the future and using the law as a force for good in both the courtroom and our communities. Online at cerisiconlon.com.
Hello and welcome. I think you're going to be in for a real treat tonight. My guest is a children's book illustrator and author. You've probably heard of him. He's making a lot of news here in our state. Mike Wohnoutka is with me, and he recently won in 2021 the Theodore Seuss Geisel Award for Best Children's Literature for the Young Children in the United States. So that was such an exciting honor, Mike.
It was, and yeah, thank you for having me, Mary. It's an honor to be on your show. Yeah, that's the biggest award I've received for one of my books, and David LaRochelle, the author, and I found out about it this Sunday night before the ALA awards were announced, and we were told we were going to be on a panel discussion for ALA, and it happened to be, we got onto the panel meeting, or the Zoom meeting, and there was the Theodore Seuss Geisel committee telling us that we won.
Oh, so it was a
medal,
surprise.
It was a surprise.
Of the biggest sort.
And it was one of the best things about it was David was right there on the Zoom so we could see each other. And
Aww.
It was so emotional because it really was such a huge honor. And so we just started crying. We were just so honored and so excited about it. And so,
when you work in your own home office, and your partner David does too, I bet, then to have that kind of recognition is such a shot in the arm, I bet, that keeps you going and motivated to keep, working hard, right?
Yeah, I don't know if
If you need an award to keep going?
Yeah. No, it did. I mean, I don't know if it did that to us, but it definitely, David and I, we've collaborated on, that was I think our fourth book. We both have written and illustrated many books. This was my 32nd book.
32nd.
Yeah. So it just was, I don't know. I don't know how to say that. I'm sorry.
It wasn't like you were just your first time out and boom, it happened. I mean,
exactly, yeah, there you go.
You've worked hard, you really deserve this. But I was telling him that in the world of artists and people who are talented in the kind of way he is, musicians, dancers, artists, writers, it's not easy to have a career evolve out of a passion. It's quite rare, I think. I mean, a lot of people do it part-time, and that's wonderful too, but to be able to make it such a career is rare.
Yeah, I do think it is pretty rare, and I definitely, after I graduated from art school, it took six years to get that first children's book.
Did it?
And I definitely had to work part-time for quite a while before I slowly worked, fewer hours at the job I had, until probably 15 years ago, I went completely full-time writing and illustrating books.
And that's important. I want the audience to be sure they know that not only are you an illustrator, but you've also written many books as the author and illustrator.
Yep.
So that's cool. So going back to high school and college days, you had a couple important turning point kind of events, didn't you? Your teacher in high school, tell us just how he encouraged you.
Yeah, I was really fortunate. I had a wonderful high school art teacher. His name was Mr. Chase, and I still remember the day he told me, I was a senior in high school, and he told me that, he pulled me out into the hallway and said that, you know, Mike, if you start taking your artwork more seriously, you could do this for a career, a living. And that really changed the way I was thinking about my work, and I started just working a lot harder. And he also told me to think about expressing myself through my art. And that senior year of high school, I did a drawing of my dad, and I entered it into a statewide competition, a scholastic art show. And that drawing of my dad ended up earning me a 4-year scholarship to study art at the Savannah
Mike.
College of Art and Design.
Wow, so you got a lot of encouragement early on, didn't you?
Yeah, oh, for sure, from that high school art teacher. Yep.
And then you said in college there was another kind of turning point. Mention that if you would, because it's interesting.
Yeah, so when Mr. Chase mentioned the career, I just had no idea what kind of career that would be. I just wanted to be some kind of artist. You know, I didn't realize you could be a children's book illustrator until I was in art school. And one of the first weeks of art school was, they focused on a different major each week, and they focused on illustration. So they brought in all of these illustrators to talk about their work. And I went to this presentation by a guy named David Shannon, and he had just illustrated his first book. It was called How Many Spots Does a Leopard Have? And he talked about the process of illustrating the book, and it was like a light bulb went over my head. I thought,
There's
you can do that?
route for me.
Yeah, and so from that moment on, I knew that I wanted to illustrate books, because when I was a kid, I loved Richard Scarry, P.D. Eastman, Sid Hoff books, but I had no idea that Richard Scarry and P.D. Eastman were real people working in a studio creating these books.
Hold this up because Richard Scarry, I'm sure, is someone that a lot of parents and grandparents and children have read and loved.
Yeah.
But not everyone may remember it by name, so
Yeah.
now they,
His work obviously has endured. I mean,
it's really endured.
It's amazing.
And then the other book you mentioned that, well, you mentioned a couple, but the Sid Hoff book
Yes. Yep.
was another one of
That
your
was one
favorites.
of my favorites. Yep.
Did you have a definite, here we go, a definite interest early on in pursuing children's illustrations and children's books? I mean, that's an interesting choice.
Yeah, I didn't. Like I said, I didn't realize they were real people. We never had author visits at our school when I was in elementary school, so it never dawned on me. I just thought books magically appeared in the library. I didn't know they were real people until I was in college, until David Shannon did that presentation, and then it was this, So as a child, I never thought of myself as possibly being a children's book illustrator.
But you loved books, obviously.
But I loved books, and I do remember, especially Richard Scarry, poring over those illustrations and loving them so much and trying to emulate and copy the illustrations. But it never dawned on me that I could do that for a job.
And I read somewhere, there have been a lot of articles about this man. I read somewhere that your father, am I remembering right, would bring home reams of paper from his work as a highway engineer?
Yeah, so.
Am I right?
Yep, so my dad worked at the highway department, and there were these really large sheets of paper, probably 14 inches by 18 inches, that had survey notes on one side, which I didn't understand, but they were blank on the other. And he would bring home stacks of paper.
Like big stacks.
Big stacks.
Stacks.
I mean, like really.
Yeah, really big stacks.
So I just had all of this paper to draw on, and I was really fortunate because my 3 older brothers were all really interested in art, and they were all very good at drawing. So I was the youngest, and my oldest brother is 10 years older than me. So when he was 14 and I was 4, I was just in awe of his drawing skills, and I wanted to be able to do that. And I remember just trying to be as good as they were. So.
So you had all kinds of influences, didn't you, that led you? But
Yeah.
but then double back, and the question I wondered about why children's books grabbed your attention more than juvenile, teenage books or adult books. Of course, most adult books don't have a lot of illustrations.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe that was a big part of it.
Yeah, and I definitely, consider myself more of an illustrator than author.
Okay, I didn't.
Before I wrote my first book, I had illustrated 20 books by other authors. And one of the things about when I was in art school, when I saw David Shannon's presentation, at that time there were these great books coming out, like The True Story of the Three Little Pigs, The Stinky Cheese Man, The Salamander Room. These were all books that were these beautiful paintings, and I had never seen children's books like that. So it was kind of this renaissance children's books, or these new way of illustrating books. So that really was inspiring as well. And David Shannon's work was very painterly. At that time I was really interested in acrylic painting and oil painting, and these these illustrations were more like that. So that aesthetic was something I was interested in as well.
Before we go any further, I want to show the audience just one of your illustrations so they know what we're talking about here. Do you want to pick one out of this book, which was the one of the award-winning books from the Theodore Geisel Award?
Well, this is, so the dog, the story is about a dog that the narrator is saying something different. It's saying, see the blue cat, and there's obviously, this is not a blue cat.
You know what, I'll hold it, and then I can kind of get the angle right here.
So this is a story that David LaRochelle wrote, and I'm the illustrator of. And working with David is a little different than working with other authors, because David and I are actually very good friends. So, and we're part of the same writers group. So he'll bring in a story, and it's more collaborative than working with other authors, because oftentimes I never even meet the author of the books I illustrate.
With some of the other books you've illustrated.
So with David, he's open to suggestions that I have for the story.
So you're kind of a bit more than just the illustrator when you work with David, it sounds like.
A little bit more, yeah. So he's definitely open to, like I said, story suggestions. And
one of the things that I thought that in talking to people just in general around town, I think people underestimate how hard it is to write a book or to illustrate a book. And they may think when they see, just a few words in a book and not that many pages of illustrations, well, I think I could do that. I think I could do that in at least a couple weeks. Well, tell us the fact, how long it takes to write a book.
Yeah, there definitely is that perception.
Or to illustrate a book.
There's definitely that perception that it looks so easy. David wrote a book. Our first collaboration was a book titled Moo, and it's just a one-word picture book. Yeah. And people see that book and say, wow, David didn't really have anything to do. He just wrote the word moo, and it's just different, with different punctuation.
Oh, I thought the book was right here, but
I think there it's on the bottom.
Is it the bottom one?
But it's the concept that is so brilliant that David came up with. And a lot of people, I get a lot of requests or people saying that they have an idea for for a book, but an idea is much different than a book, because you have to, flesh that story out, that idea out, and that's where the work comes. So like the idea is just a small percentage of it. Like David wanted to write a one-word book, but then he worked really hard to come up with exactly the the narrative and how to.
I mean, that even sounds harder than to write a book which would have lots of, language.
Yeah, and I hear this from my friends that write, middle grade books or YA books, when they try to write a picture book, they're like, that's the hardest genre to write because every word counts in a picture book.
Like you said, kind of like poetry, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, every word counts, and every illustration matters greatly, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, one of my observations, and I hope you'll search out his books after you meet him here, but one of my observations, Mike, is that there is a subtle humor that is real adult kind of humor in these books, I think. That adults chuckle, I'm sure, when they read, as well as children maybe giggle, you know? And have you had a lot of people tell you that?
Yeah, it is very fulfilling when parents tell me that they don't mind reading these stories over and over because they find them funny as well. That's definitely gratifying to hear that. And it's nice that you say that, and that you think they find them humorous as well. And
it's kind of a unique humor too. You know, I'm thinking like with the recent winning books, See the Cat and See the Dog. I mean, that's kind of a offbeat humor in a way, I'd say.
Yeah, and that's David. David, I tell people this all the time. He's the most creative person I know in children's books, and I feel very fortunate to be working with him. And his humor is just, it's...
And he's a Twin Cities resident?
Yep, he lives in White Bear Lake. And,
okay.
Yep.
When you talk about the idea, the germ of a book, you brought some sketches.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit how that evolves when you have an idea and then you start doing some drawing. How does that evolve?
Yeah, so for me, when I'm writing, it always starts in my sketchbook. It starts with coming up with a character, thinking about a problem for that character. And for example, my book, Dad's First Day, is a story about me struggling, well, to let my kids, Franklin and Olivia, go off to school for the first time. So how this evolved was I was sitting at my writing desk. I couldn't think of anything to write about, so I ended up just drawing a picture of myself sitting at my drawing table trying to write. So I drew a picture, kind of a cartoon character of myself, and I thought, well, maybe I could write a story about this guy. So I started thinking about what I was struggling with, and that was struggling with Franklin and Olivia, letting them go off to school for the first time. So I decided that that might be a good idea for a story. Every story needs some kind of struggle. So then it just starts, from that point on, I just start sketching different situations.
So the sketches come before the words?
They simultaneously.
Simultaneously.
It's just like when I'm drawing or writing, I'm sketching at the same time, writing words, jotting them down. And then it just slowly evolves. And sometimes, you know, I have hundreds of stories that are partially written because oftentimes that seed of an idea
doesn't it hits a dead end.
It hits a dead end.
Is that a way to put it?
And that's where when people talk about that writing looks easy or picture books look easy, the one thing I want to say is go try it and see what happens. Because it is more difficult than it looks. And I think that's another thing with any art, and I think especially picture books and children's books, is you want to make it look like it was effortless.
Yes.
You want to hone it down to just the fewest words and to make it look like it was jotted down, you know, very quickly. Does that make sense? So
that makes sense. I mean, I think of running, and people who are the fastest runners look like it's not hard at all.
Yeah.
They're flying along. They're so efficient. And so that's a parallel, I guess, that comes to my mind.
And it takes a lot of work to get to that point of running so effortlessly.
Right.
So.
Is it hard to let a storyline go that you've gotten maybe halfway through and then you hit this dead end?
It's really hard.
I'm thinking that would be very, you must get, you know, fighting yourself sometimes.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, I don't throw anything away. Like, I have piles and piles and piles of story ideas. So I definitely go back to those stories every once in a while, and sometimes I see them in a different way. There's an example of this book I wrote, So Big. It was inspired by when Franklin, my son, was picked up that first day of kindergarten, and that big school bus showed up. So I drew this little bear and this huge school bus, and I knew there was a story there. It often starts with just that one image, you know, and I started sketching out this bear, starting school, and then I got stuck. And it just sat there for 6 years until Franklin started middle school, and he went to middle school at Sanford, which is a huge school in Minneapolis. And when we drove up to that school for the first time and saw that huge school, it inspired me to go back to that drawing of the bear and the bus, and something clicked, and I just wrote that story fairly quickly after that. So
that must have felt wonderful to
it did.
be able to have a completion there with that.
Yeah, and I loved that sketch so much of the bear and this school bus, and to be able to use that finally for a story was very fulfilling.
Do you sometimes go into your workspace, your office, and just have nothing exciting happening in terms of ideas, or are you always coming up with something?
The former, always.
Always.
Almost always I feel like nothing is going to happen today. You know, I go up there feeling like but the trick is oftentimes I will say I'm going to only write for 20 minutes. And then I start sketching and playing with characters, and almost every time something starts to happen. And sometimes it feels like I've got a story today. And then I wake up the next morning and go back up to my studio, and there was nothing there. But the trick for me is to try to show up every day and write for a little bit, you know, and I have found that if I do that, eventually something will click.
Okay, so discipline is a big, important piece of this, isn't it?
And like I said, I give myself a break by the time limitation sometimes, because sometimes I have a deadline for another book, so I'll just go up and try to, but keeping my mind on new story ideas is really important.
So you really are a true creative person, aren't you?
Well, I do. Well, for sure I would not be able to make a living if I was just a writer, because I don't have the ideas coming as, you know, fast enough to keep that going. So I feel fortunate that I illustrate as well. So between
sort of a double whammy talent here.
Well, that is very nice. And for the last 5 years, I've pretty much just written my own stories or illustrated David's stories, and that's been a really nice.
So you haven't had outside other authors to work with, is what you're saying, beyond David, the last 5 years. Okay.
Yeah, so that's been really nice. And not that. And there have been offers from other publishers for stories that just haven't really resonated with me, and I love working with David. You know, like I said, we're good friends.
If it's working, right,
so,
just keep it going.
So we're going to try to keep this going as long as we can.
I've interviewed authors, you know, from many genres through the years, and I think one of the misconceptions, another misconception on the public's part, is that, well, the book is wonderful, it's ready to go, certainly there'll be a publisher. But that doesn't always, now it maybe in your case is falling into place well, but it doesn't always mean, even no matter how great the product and the book is, that you'll get a publisher.
Yeah, you know, this kind of goes back to the question I had a hard time answering when you first asked about the Geisel Award and how that was like, I don't know, maybe like we finally made it, David and I feeling that way. And there was a moment of that, but then I had 2 stories that I had written that I felt really good about. And I sent them to my editor, the same editor that See the Cat. And she ended up turning them down, and I thought, after this award,
After the
I won't be able to get
award.
anything published.
Yeah,
So
I
that was very
bet.
humbling. And
I bet that was.
but it was also, I appreciated her honesty because she didn't feel they were strong enough.
Good as.
And
But that's a good, I'm thinking for budding writers or people any place on the continuum, that's good to know that that happened to you, and you're continuing on. You didn't let it stop you.
yeah, and David is,
Yeah.
I consider him a much stronger writer. And he had stories turned down by our editor as
Yeah.
well
I mean,
after
it
the Geisel
happens,
Award. And
of course.
And you want that editor to hold you to a high standard. You don't want them to just publish
But
your
you-
stories.
You also sometimes know that something is really good, and if they say no, you can take it to another publisher, right?
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Dad's First Day. I brought that to an editor. She didn't see the potential of it. And it definitely evolved from what I first sent out.
So
but I
you
sent,
kept working on it.
I kept working. Well, the concept I sent, pretty much the same concept, or the same book dummy to a different editor, but she saw something in there, and she encouraged me to do a couple things to the story. I took that advice, and it evolved into Dad's First Day. So I mean,
Congratulations.
it wasn't, and that's another thing I should mention is that when I write a story, there's always, editorial notes. I'm working with that editor to improve the
So
story.
it's not just your own or David's sense of it, right?
Yeah, it's
Right.
not finished.
Right.
When I feel like it's finished, when I send it
Yeah.
in, there's still
There's
a
more
process.
work to be done.
Exactly.
Well, we're out of time. I'd love to keep talking. It's so fascinating to learn more about the process and your success here. Is there a place people can go to find out more about some of your work, and a website, or how would you direct people to find more?
Yeah, I have a website, just my name, MikeWohnoutka.com, and
Okay.
there's lots of information.
Okay.
My book's on there.
MikeWohnoutka.com.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I appreciate you
Continued
inviting
success
me. Yeah,
as you
thanks.
go. Oh, he was so fun to talk to. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.